Thank you, everybody, for the organisers, and hello to those that are joining in live and maybe those who will look at the video later on. Can I also acknowledge that although I'm speaking from Canberra, the national capital, I do speak on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and to recognise that their lands were never ceded. I'd also like to say to all the Scottish friends out there that my grandmother was Scottish, and it's nice to be able to have the connection. And finally, if you see this small little thing here, as they say, you should see the other bloke. So don't worry about it. Child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church has corroded episcopal power, made a mockery of the institution's moral leadership, and scandalised ordinary Catholics worldwide. The crimes of abuse and cover-up have laid bare the craven self-interest of the institution, the arrogance of its leadership, and the blatant disregard for the laws of the land. Wherever there have been public inquiries into the Catholic Church response to child sexual abuse, assault, and rape, there have been findings that the church officials placed the interests of the institution, its assets and reputation before the welfare of children and the obligations of the law. An all too familiar scenario has characterised the sex abuse scandal. Victims were disbelieved and intimidated. Church officials were found to have obfuscated, even lied, to protect offending priests and religious. Financial reparations were modest at best, inconsistently applied, and subject to confidentiality clauses. An atmosphere of secrecy dominated the management of abuse cases. Allegations of child sexual assault were generally not reported to police and public authorities. Known perpetrators were shifted to new posts where unsuspecting parishioners and students became their prey. Clericalism ensured a lack of accountability and transparency. And even though church records of abuse cases were kept by church authorities dating back at least 70, if not more years, it has only been in recent times that the extent and scope of the nature of the abuse and its cover-up has been made public through the insistence of public authorities, not the honesty of the institution. The cover-up culture has had an insidious effect. Without doubt, far less children would have been the subject of sexual abuse if accountability, transparency, lawfulness, and honesty were features of the institution's response to abuse allegations. Let's face it, being associated with the Catholic Church is a cause for shame. There is a collective shadow we all cast. But who has been responsible? Bishops, religious leaders, and senior church officials exercised power ruthlessly and victims were oppressed and truth was repressed. Public inquiries consistently found a failure in leadership, in many cases at the highest levels of the institution, and sadly, even today there are reports echoing the same allegation. They also point to the culture of the institution as a significant contributing factor. Coming to terms with the culture is the Rubicon that must be crossed if we want to learn the lessons of the abuse scandal. Cultural anthropologists, particularly Father Gerald Arbuckle, stress that unless we understand how culture works, we are doomed to fail in any serious endeavour for change. So how would we describe the culture of the church? Well, put simply, culture is what we do. But Jerry Arbuckle would say it's more than that. It is primarily what we feel about what we do. It gives the comforting feeling of order and belonging when faced with a chaotic world. It clings to us in ways that we are rarely conscious. It is the safety net in times of confusion, stress, or trauma. In subtle ways, it inhibits personal agency and in turn controls ethical boundaries. The church has many microcultures. For example, schools, parishes, health and social services have distinct cultures within the broader accepted culture of the church. However, the features of those cultures have a logical consistency. Power and authority are based on a concept of religious belief and in turn, compliance. Allegiance to the institution or the congregation or even the parish is aligned with a personal religious commitment to one's faith and its obligations. So, in a very real sense, participating in being church, whether in institutional roles like being a cleric or an administrator, or as a member of a faith community like a parish or a religious congregation. This is a deeply personal expression of identity and purpose. And as a consequence, when that identity and meaning making is threatened, defensiveness comes to the fore. The abuse scandal has been analysed from the perspective of the church as an institution with its attendant features, namely a hierarchical structure, its own internal legal system, a clerical caste, and a dominant male class. As Arbuckle counsels, this has a culture, and the culture has a life of its own. Its language is silent, and it is forever active in new manifestations that resists attempts of eradication. That is, unless we confront the cover-up culture, name it for what it is, actively displace the underlying myths and beliefs that fuel dysfunction, we are at risk of it prevailing in ever new and potent ways. Arbuckle, along with others, describes the culture that gave rise to and concealed child sexual abuse as being both corrupt and systemic. As such, those responsible for the scandal are those who oversaw a system and its processes that were in turn corrupt. That is why the church must not be able to investigate itself, nor keep any of its internal processes of complaint handling at a distance from the law. Catholics have struggled with the reality that some bishops, religious leaders, and church officials have been corrupt. The leaders themselves have been shocked that their behaviour is seen as being corrupt. This speaks volumes about the culture in which the behaviour occurred. The fact that otherwise decent people can be blind to their actions, such that they apparently fail to see the evil implication of their decisions, demonstrates how powerfully the culture of compliance to the interests of the institution can work. That the culture can portray loyalty as a priority above all else, even the welfare of vulnerable children, indicates how an institution's values shape the mindset and instincts of its adherents, particularly in times of crisis and threat. For example, see how intractable the church hierarchy are to amending the protocols of the sacrament of confession. When a child tells a priest in the sacrament that they have been abused, they are not confessing their sin. Yet the Roman Curia insists that this information cannot be shared by the priest under the threat of breaking the seal of confession, even though the seal does not apply to a child sharing information about a sin perpetrated on them. The intransigence and relegation of the welfare of the child to the interests of the institution makes a mockery of the rhetoric church leaders mouth in front of TV cameras and in public inquiries. If they genuinely wanted to respect the dignity and worth of the child, they would find a way through the dilemma. Even when the church has been challenged to do so, it dismisses the protocol and proposal outright, and then plays the culture wars card and the need for religious freedom. Meanwhile, the trust of the community continues to wane. It was this collective mindset that facilitated the cover-ups and concealments. It was the same mindset that sought to excuse bishops and leaders, whilst being careful not to excuse the perpetrators. It's the mindset that tried to spin that the issue was about a few bad apples in the bunch. It was a mindset that refused to accept that it was about the culture and the abuse of power. This is the mindset that is determined to safeguard the institution and stave off necessary reform. Of course, within that culture, there were and still are individuals with their own moral compass. The records show that clergy and religious did speak out on occasions, did object to the treatment of victims, and often they did leave in protest. But the reality is that the weight of the culture to comply, to turn a blind eye, to rationalise, even excuse, was so suffocating that the corruption continued unabated. The revelations of abuse and its management has eroded trust in bishops and leaders. Frankly, they alone are incapable of addressing the cultural questions. Only a collective effort, laity and clergy, signed on to a process of reform will have any chance of remediating the defects of the culture. So we need to move into a period of intentional disruption. This is best done in a public and accountable fashion. Dioceses should immediately establish cultural audits with specific terms of engagement that examine the everyday workings of the church in all its manifestations. The results need to be made public and be open for public discussion. It is a starting point and not an end in itself. Substantial reform requires a commitment for change that is prepared to risk identity and reputation, pursue a refounding in integrity, and tolerate the loss of adherents who can't make the journey. The institution needs to shed the implicit assumptions and beliefs that cause violence, abuse, and cover-up. This requires identifying those attitudes that condone ruthless behaviour, expedient approaches to vulnerable people, and lying to save the institution. It must acknowledge and address how power is exercised, how participation in decision-making is manipulated, and by whom. It needs to demonstrate how the dependency on a rigid identity and institutional character perpetuates a culture that disenfranchises adherents, denies wrongdoing, protects the powerful, and instills secrecy as a working assumption. It needs to acknowledge those myths and stories that are false and lead to evil outcomes. For example, notions such as a judgmental God that only leads to persecution and despair, or concepts like intrinsically disordered sexuality that discriminates and demonizes. Arbuckle and others counsel that strategy alone will not suffice. Culture is too powerful and regenerative to be contained just by a few new protocols and practices. Because culture always fights back, clouding the truth and keeping unconscious that which must be brought into the light. Confronting the institution is a perilous task. This is particularly so when the institution is in a state of trauma. Australian bishop, the late Geoffrey Robinson, famously wrote that to get to the core of the corrupt cover-up culture, the church must confront its approach to power and sex. He was castigated in conservative circles, yet vindicated by all public inquiries. The abuse of power and the jaundiced attitude towards sex have rendered the institution increasingly ossified in its pastoral and mission activities. His siren call was aggressively hushed because too many people in positions of power, comfort, and entitlement feared the collapse of the house of cards. The upshot is a church in despair. The disenchantment of the laity with the institution has left the episcopal leadership confused and frightened. The active pursuit of civil and criminal claims by victims has senior officials defensive and paranoid, concerned or obsessed over the future assets of the church. The loss of public esteem and corruption in their ranks has the clergy demoralised and disorganised. The Catholic community is shocked and increasingly voting with their feet. Participation in weekend worship is dropping at alarming rates. With the loss of trust in bishops and the clergy, it is now left to the laity to drive the change. Insist on co-responsible governance of dioceses. The same in church ministries, so that a relevant pastoral engagement will characterise the presence of Catholicism in our world. This paradigm shift in governance will be resisted. If for no other reason than bishops fear that sharing governance responsibilities is somehow to lose authority. That fear is based on the assumptions that underpin any hierarchical structure. That is, those at the top have the authority, regardless of competency or capability. It must be said that to be blindly loyal to the hierarchical, patriarchal institution, as if it's God's will for the church, is a modern-day heresy. Moreover, it embeds a veto mentality on behalf of the bishops. It instills a sense of intimidation for subordinates and hesitancy to question and critique. It builds a dysfunctional notion of loyalty and ultimately breeds a disposition of passivity and compliance, regardless of the facts or circumstances. This type of culture finds no place for accountability and transparency. Rather, it marks success in terms of the eradication of conflict and the quashing of dissent. It turns religious instruction into ideology, religious identity into political posturing, and religious affiliation into a character test. Our church is at a low ebb. The scandal has shown how venal the institution can be. The loss of trust threatens to widen and split the church between those seeking change and those clinging to a pre-Vatican II styled hierarchy and medieval structure. We need to embark on the slow, arduous task of cultural reform. The scandal has broken the heart of the church. Catholics intuitively know that the church has not acted in a way consistent with the gospel. Reform must be based on the gospel. It must be spirit-led. We must put on the mind of Christ, not the mentality of a corporate risk management. In practical terms, some fundamentals are required. 1, reform is not merely a political exercise as much as it is a desire for authenticity and integrity in the light of the gospel. 2, bishops and leaders need to sign on to reform. Without those in positions of authority being fully on board, the tensions for change will split the church rather than heal and grow the faith community. Thirdly, reform is a process of co-responsibility. That is, laity and clergy, equally involved in all stages of analysis and decision-making. Synodality, employed properly, can facilitate mutual discernment. Fourthly, canon law should reflect the discerned directions for the church in the structural changes and pastoral practice, rather than limiting the imagination of the faithful. The methodology to address reform needs to also be outlined. And here are some working assumptions that might be helpful. Firstly, best practice organisational and cultural insights should be applied to church structures and processes. It is not enough to settle with a mantra that says only those who understand ecclesiology get the gig. We're talking about a human institution where human best practices, understandings, and knowledge and experience have some role. Secondly, wherever possible, democratize in decision-making, say in appointment processes, and certainly in financial accountabilities. Resist instilling a hierarchical structure that bleaches accountability from processes. Thirdly, integrate gender balance and diversity at all levels of governance. Fourthly, encourage and facilitate public scrutiny and reporting. Be honest, open, and transparent. And fifthly, function as an open as opposed to closed system. Most importantly, reform and its practice needs to be nourished and directed by a spirituality that is open, humble, and searching. As a faith community, that means humility. The good news is that a lot of the groundwork for change has already been done. Well-considered pathways to achieve greater accountability and transparency in governance and management have already been outlined. Post the Royal Commission in Australia, the bishops and religious leaders commissioned an examination into diocesan and other church governance and management structures. The resulting Light from the Southern Cross report provides practical and far-reaching recommendations that shift the paradigm from a hierarchical culture reliant on the residue of clerical privilege to a more synodal culture of mutual participation between laity and clergy in models of co-responsible governance. So, why insist on the governance shift? Governance is ultimately about the stewardship of the church. And integral to that stewardship are the teachings and pastoral outreach that are relevant and engaging of contemporary life. Lay women and men, just as much as clergy and religious, are capable sources and resources of experience and wisdom that can inform good decision-making and sound foundations for teaching and pastoral practice. We must actively engage the insights from the physical and human sciences, including cosmology and ecological understandings, which will better ground our theology, particularly about the human person, and in turn break down discrimination and exclusion. It will provide the foundations for a more relational-based moral theology. It will provide a respect for gender that insists on equality. And it will encourage a democratic and inclusive style of governance across the board. This sets the church on a new course, more relevant for the postmodern times and less clerical. It frees up the faithful to better hear the cries of the Spirit and more creatively respond to the missionary impulse Pope Francis says is our clarion call. Too many people have been abused in the Catholic Church. Too many vulnerable children. Their lives, in many cases, were irreparably damaged. We need to see them as our present-day prophets. Their experience is speaking back into our reality. There is a voice that is powerful and important. It is a voice like the Spirit that is formative and telling. Our responsibility, our obligation, is not only to listen, but to acknowledge that that voice is the voice of the Spirit. It is the formative voice, the creative voice, the voice that asks of us, when I was naked, did you see me? It is the voice that says to us today, you are capable, you have what it takes. Shape the church in the heart of Christ. And we need to do it as a responsible reaction to what the history of abuse has demonstrated to us. For people tonight who unfortunately have too much proximity to the abuse scandal or to the experience themselves, I sincerely hope that if anything I've said has upset you, that there is some support nearby. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francis. As you mentioned, we do have some resources on our homepage, and Paul Campbell from Access will talk about it afterwards with some links. That was so powerful. I'm going to thank you a bit later, but thank you so much. And we are doing this in solidarity with these present day prophets that you mentioned. So we are trying. Thank you very much. We're now going to go over to some questions. I haven't been looking at the chat because I've been focusing on you, but I think there have been a lot of questions coming in, and Rhiannon and Jeffrey, her husband, will be asking you some questions from their selection. But please, everybody, realize that we can't get to all the questions. We're just going to do our best to take a selection. Thank you.
As you said, Penelope, there are a lot of questions and observations and some direct questions as well. Jeffrey and I will get through as many as we can, but we do invite you all to have a look at the chat, because we won't be able to get through all of them, and it's a rich repository of ideas and suggestions and questions. So do please, all of you, have a look if you can multitask while you're also listening to the questions and Francis's responses. If I could just start, if I may, with a couple of questions that were sent to us directly just prior to this event. And the first question, I think, Francis, touches on your point that lay women and men are capable. I think your words were capable resources of experience and wisdom that can inform decision making, and amen to that. And the question was this: lay people's support is needed to maintain clericalism in the light of an absence of communication channels for laity to contact other laity. Do you, Francis, have any suggestions as to how we can reach out to many more lay people to help them realise that in one way or another they're contributing to the conditions in which abuse flourishes?
Well, that's a great question.
It's a big question.
I can go from our own experience here in Canberra, where a number of Catholics, in seeing what was the Royal Commission was revealing, had the reaction which most of us do, which is shock and shame, and then you either feel overwhelmed or you say, well, the first place is to assemble together and use a common desire, and then use your nuts to work out what to do next. So we created a group called Concerned Catholics, which is a great name. Because as Catholics, we got some concerns, right? So I would encourage any group of people to begin to meet and discuss and share your experiences and to strategize together. And you will be surprised what wisdom is in your group. I think the really important thing for lay Catholics to always know, we have what it takes. Be confident in your capacity. The only reason some of us think we haven't got what it takes is because we bought the gig. Well, we clerics and others must be better than us. Well, the history has shown they're not. So be confident in yourself and be confident in your brothers and sisters. So set up just a small support group and begin to share experiences, and then you'll get in touch, and you'll, like this, you can tap into resources and you can begin to show how they apply in your local scene.
Thanks ever so much. And Francis, you probably know, you'll be pleased to hear that certainly here in the UK, we're doing just that.
Right.
So the last direct question that I'd like to ask, if I may, before we get onto those in the chat, I'll do my best to do justice to this quite lengthy question, but I think it is an important one. And it came to us from a postdoctoral researcher into clergy abuse of adults, and he's asking a question relating to a well-known priest who I mentioned to you earlier on when we met just before the session started. And he's asking the question, what do you think about the statement that this well-known priest, this notorious priest, made, in his words, to a Catholic businessman when it was becoming clear about his, as he puts it, weird and abusive behaviors, when he was asked, aren't you even worried about what might happen to you? And his response was, I'm not worried about what the bishops can do to me because of what I know about the bishops. And according to our questioner, this is a genuine story. And if he meant this, the questioner goes on, could this be one of the bases and the most frequent causes of cover-up and inaction?
Look,
it's a big question.
Yeah. You know, the first thing that I wanted, and I emphasized it at the end, remember, the church has always operated as a closed system. It's resisted outside scrutiny. It has its own code of promotion and entitlement. And those who break the rules, the internal rules, are castigated accordingly. That's how the show works. And that's why even these conversations, being so public and free-flowing, get right up the nose of some people, because this is not how it's meant to be. So, of course, within that culture, people are intimidated about information people have about each other. But it's a control mechanism. And we all have a choice. Play in that culture or move out of that culture. Out it for what it is. Stand up for what you believe are strong values of integrity and authenticity. And as I said, base it on a proper spiritual practice and support for each other in a faith community. But don't comply through silence.
Thank you very much for that, Francis. Very profound response. Thank you. Right, Geoffrey and I are going to go straight to the chat now, if we may, and we're starting with an observation, with a kind of questioning tone, if I may. And it is this, Francis, your starting point regarding cultural audits of dioceses appears an impossibility here in the UK without the laity. Actually, going back to your point about, as lay Catholics, we do have what it takes, without the laity taking collective action such as they've never done before. And the question is quite simple: can Australia give us hope in relation to this?
Well, I think the movements are improving in Australia around this, and most recently, just the other day, it wasn't perfect, but at least the Bishops' Conference are putting out an annual report. It wasn't conclusive enough, and it wasn't far-reaching enough, but it was a gesture. Now, the trouble with that is that if it was a gesture, then it needs to be jumped on. If it's a timid first effort, then it needs to be dragged further. I think through the plenary council processes and through reform groups here in Australia, the issues around accountability and proper financial accountability particularly are becoming pressure points for diocesan structures. I really think we've got to be careful that we don't fall into a trap, and that is those that don't want any of this are trying to shape the whole thing up like a new set of culture wars. This is about those culture wars. This is about authenticity and integrity as faith communities. a faith community that has a massive institution as part of it. And as I said in the earlier presentation, the behaviour of the leadership has meant that now we need to step up because, frankly, we are the church.
Mm. Thanks ever so much. A very, very interesting point here relating to something you said earlier on about the dominant male class, and it's this. What's really feared is the exposure of the secret of 50% of clergy or so abandoning chastity as part of celibacy. And the comment goes on, that's what they worried about, the loss of male celibate power, the loss of a male celibate power base. Would you concur with that broadly?
Oh, well, look,
yeah.
the church, we can't
More than broadly.
keep perpetrating that model. I mean,
yeah.
Look, we just have to look at the world we live in and the decent people we live with and the way that we structure our communities, the way that we now encourage diversity and equality in the workplace between genders, the way that we value democratic processes rather than authoritarian, the way that we think about what's right and wrong in relational terms, not in sort of rigid do's and don'ts. Yeah. These are insights of wisdom through human endeavour and search that are examples of a graced world. And, you know, we've got to catch up to God because we can get caught in an institution that's back in time. We've got to catch up to God.
I like that catch up to God. And you made the earlier point that reform needs to be directed by spiritual practice, didn't you? That's very good. Just before Geoffrey, I think, is going to come in with some observations in a moment, but we have an interesting comment here, and it's around this. It would require the faithful in Australia, I think the context is, to take unprecedented action. However, the comment goes on, there are significant groups giving strong voice to the need for reform. There is a coalition of Catholics for church reform, yet at the local level, it is indeed perilous and requires incredible commitment and persistence, which can only come, point you made very, very lucidly, Francis, when we act collectively, when we act in community.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's about, we need to keep supporting each other. I mean, the hierarchy always uses inertia as a management tool. So it sucks the energy out of people. And unfortunately, a lot of people sort of feel despair and give up. But I mean, the reality is it's our church.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should decide to create a vacuum. It's our church. We are the church.
We are the church.
And let's keep on giving people confidence about that.
That's a very empowering concept, isn't it? And it is the truth and reality. If I saw it, because I think slightly related to that, if I could just come in with the subsequent comment very, very quickly, and that is around a 2020 CDF report, which refers, amongst other things, to anonymous reports of an offence should not be automatically lead to considering reports as false. Nonetheless, and this is a point I think that's being made, anonymous reports certainly should not be encouraged. And the comment goes on, up until 2020, bishops could or should discount such reports as false, not just question unsubstantiated. And the concept of whistleblowing is to be discouraged. There's a question mark there. Having undergone training, says our commenter, in my diocese for safeguarding for a number of years, I would have treated an anonymous complaint as false. I would never, I beg your pardon, I would never have treated an anonymous complaint as false. I'd have passed it on as required, assuming it would be addressed once in the hands of the bishop. The hierarchy, the commentator goes on, are not fit for purpose in that regard.
Well, I think the first point is that the history of the church dealing with itself and investigating itself is miserable. The instinct is too self-protective. And even when it comes down to, anonymous allegations, all allegations need to be handled by an outside authority that has no connection to the church leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, because you made the point, didn't you, that the church really mustn't be able to investigate itself. You could say that about any number of bodies, and it's quite true. Thank you. Jeffrey, have you picked up one or two?
Yes, indeed.
Great.
Hi there, Francis. Hi. Very, very interesting talk, by the way. Thank you. There are several comments about members of the clergy, bishops and priests being who's to stand up and speak out, being bullied by their peers, and the need for the laity to support them. One question came in specifically, saying, yes, we want to support them, we want to support the clergy. How many clergy are present and listening and learning? How far do you feel that the clergy in general are aware of this need for reform, or would be agreeing with what you're saying?
Oh, look, in my experience, and that's all I can really speak about.
Sure.
Over the period that I was in those roles, I spoke to many, many assemblies of clergy. And I found that most of them get what we're talking about here. Most of them have been subject to the, if you're one of the troops doing parish work or whatever, you're often subject to the downside of the hierarchical system. I mean, the bishop runs the veto on everybody's life. So I think most clergy understand full well that there needs to be a reform of structure and processes, even from the basic issue of, people are disappearing from parishes. And with parish, when they disappear, so does the money. And frankly, if nothing else, some pragmatics like that are going to force changes, not just big amalgamations of parishes where everybody feels disenfranchised and loses that local intimate faith community sense, but rather, the capacity of the church to effect its social service in the community. So I'm optimistic about where the clergy are at. I think the bishops are in massive role conflict. They've got one eye on Rome all the time, and some of them have got their eye on the next job up, and they play like company men.
Thanks very much for that very clear response. Thank you. There is a question relating to your point about intentional disruption, Francis, and it's this. And if the questioner doesn't mind, I'm going to try my best to paraphrase quite a lengthy comment, a very interesting one. Intentional disruption is a noble response, beginning at the diocesan level. Yet for many of us desperately seeking to engage with the synodal process, which is underway at the moment, we're finding that the gatekeepers of that engagement, many of them are the lay puppets, as the commentator puts it, of the local clergy, and they have so tightly managed that engagement, leading to what can probably be called an exercise in censorship. And the direct question here to you is, how from that reality can effective intentional disruption have any traction on the scale necessary to achieve meaningful and lasting reform? And there is, just to say that there is a follow-up comment from somebody else who says that this person has put the finger on the problem, not least here in the UK. And this person imagines that there are controls to the synodal process in most parts of the globe. Oh, that's interesting.
Well, let's on the last bit first. I mean, when even the canon law will tell you that when you move into something like what we have in Australia at the moment called a plenary council, it's actually a meeting of the churches, not a meeting of the bishops. And this is again where we need to claim our ground. But what happens in Australia is that the bishops control the meetings. And they even wander off into their own private meetings to tell us what we're going to do next. I mean, that's what I mean about how compliant we can be. Now, the terms of engagement in a whole lot of things need to change. They need to change to be terms of mutual engagement. That's what I was saying earlier about co-responsibility, mutual discernment processes and the like. Now, if that is not going to be the place, then don't participate. What have we got to lose? I mean, if we're going to continue under the old system, it needs a good wake. Get over it.
Yeah.
So insist that participation is mutual.
Thank you. And as you said earlier, the culture has a life of its own, doesn't it? Before, sorry, I move back to you, Jeffrey. There are a lot of questions, a lot of so interesting. The chat, spend all day reading it. It's fascinating. I just want to, there's one other about in relation to intentional disruption. And the comment is we could intentionally disrupt financial practices in the morning by simply not contributing. This might produce cultural change very quickly. And we know that that's been practiced elsewhere. It's certainly a tactic, isn't it? Do you have a comment on that, Francis?
Oh, yeah, I know many people who no longer contribute to the diocesan coffers, but they decide that the money that they would have put there, they'll put directly into other good works of mercy in the community. Some might not even be Catholic. I mean, I think this is my point. I do think at some stage you have to stand up and say, if I'm going to participate, I will participate on the following terms. Now, you know, some might find that sounding like revolution. I think what it sounds like is people being fed up. And I think you'll find that Catholics often move down a spectrum of disenchantment and despair through to disinterest and then division. And the process is usually a quiet one. Catholics are usually pretty respectful when they leave. It's silent. Next thing you know, there's hardly anyone there. And what we need to do is be a lot more vocal about what is acceptable and what's not. Because primarily, a lot of what we're talking about is not the will of God. These are structures that require change. And in changing them, we actually run the hope that our church then will be more relevant to modern life. And if it's not if they're not interested in that scenario, then they're not actually following the gospel. I mean, it's really hard to say that, but I really feel that we've got to keep on challenging back to the gospel. And if some bishop or religious leader wants to say to us that, well, that's not the gospel, well, I'm happy to hear why it isn't.
Thank you. There's a point of information in the chat. The National Justice and Peace Network in the UK are going to hold an open meeting on, we'll put this out if that's okay, sort of my colleagues here on the Root and Branch website, we'll send it to people quite soon on the 26th of February, an opportunity to consider a justice and peace response to the synodal process. Thank you. Jeffrey, do you want to take over?
Yes, great, Francis. Interesting question has come in, thanking you for your, as they say, very hard-hitting analysis of what's going on. And an interesting question, how do you think we can help bishops at a human level to share responsibility, ask for help, learn new skills and understanding? How can the bishops be helped to move on?
I think it's a complex one because, as I said, bishops to me seem like they're in role conflict. You know, they want to be pastoral leaders. At the same time, they want to be company men, not look like they're promoting or assisting something that the mob in Rome think looks like a demolition job. So they're in role conflict. Concerned Catholics, for example, and the other reform groups in Australia go out of their way to send bishops information, to invite them to things, to demonstrate that we haven't got two heads and we're not going to bite theirs off. But there's a ingrained suspicion in the hierarchy of people who want to challenge, because they automatically classify that as people being negative and critical and in some way non-negotiable. But, you know, when you go to the meetings of the reform groups, as I look on the screen, you know, most of us are over 50. A lot of us have white hair. That means two things. It means that some of us are using walkers to get around, but secondly, it means we've got wisdom. It's meant to be one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And I think we want to be saying to bishops, you know, let's meet on those terms. But, you know, it is a halfway. Both groups got to come halfway. And in my experience, it takes very little for bishops to get hypersensitive and threatened. And it's a shame, because oftentimes the people that are in the reform groups are the same people sitting in the pews. They're still turning up. They're still faithful, because this means something to us. And as I said earlier, it's not a political exercise. It's a desire for authenticity in our church. And I think that's the ground on which the bridge can be built.
Thank you. That point you've just made about we're still turning up has been made in quite a number of comments. So thank you for that. There is, if I may, just a direct question followed by, and we've only got a few minutes left, so I'll ask it briefly if I may. And the direct question to you is, how do the laity set about driving the change when this paradigm shift in governance will be ferociously resisted? I think you probably touched on that, haven't you, or quite a bit. And then the accompanying comment is, the powerful do not willingly accede, do not willingly give up power.
No,
True.
that's why I did say it's a slow process and it's arduous. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we can wave a wand. But I think, I do believe that the sincerity of our effort and the heartfelt desire of our attitudes is how you build bridges. I know that there are lots of groups who would think that we're the mob that have passed it. We're not the generation that matters anymore. And that, you know, the church is about the young and their ideas. Well, the young aren't there. So secondly, that's a problem. And thirdly, like I said, we have wisdom that needs to be constructively integrated into the discussions. And I'll say it again, I know it sounds provocative, but we must insist on the terms of engagement and not just acquiesce. You know, life's too short, right?
Yeah. 100%. The point has been made by one of my colleagues, Mary Varley, that we can hold over, and we will, a lot of these questions and observations to the fourth session, the panel session. So if your question hasn't been asked, if your observation hasn't been articulated, please remember that we are saving the chat, and we will do our best to do justice to it. Just to that slightly earlier point, Francis, you'll like this one if you haven't seen it already. As an ordained priest, to one of our guests today, I found your presentation wonderfully, in capitals, liberating. Thank you. Thank you.
Beauty.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Jeffrey, any more? We've got a couple of minutes.
Right. I think
so much positivity. Thank you so much, Francis.
Absolutely. Yes, there's a great deal here. Thanking you very much for your comments, Francis, and some very encouraging comments. And one which be saying basically, please keep on with the work that you are doing, because it has been of so great value to the movement. And I think there is one suggestion here. I don't know whether I think it's very specific, saying, suppose the idea of women in the church withdrawing their services for refusing, not attending mass, and withdrawing services for a specific period, perhaps a week, perhaps a month. I don't know whether you think that something like that as an activity would be of help. How do you feel about things like that?
Which has precedence.
Yeah.
Oh my God, who will make the cups of tea?
Exactly. Yes.
This is the thing. You know, I just feel that it's the voice for women's participation and for their equal and mutual integration into not only the governance arrangements of the church, but all the ministries of the church, needs to be shouted loudly by the men. Until men demonstrate that they get it, then the male culture in the church continues to be affirmed. And this is an issue that men have to understand, how our implicit biases keep holding up the barriers. And in Australia, if women chose not to attend worship and mass, all you would hear would be crickets, because men for a long time have been vacant. And what it also tells us, doesn't it, that even respecting what female theologians have been telling us for a long time about a more holistic approach to spirituality and its expression in liturgy, and the way women have been, in a sense, not in a sense, but realistically have been relegated in all functions and processes of the church, is really an exercise in necessity of liberation. And we, men, are the problem.
Understood.
Thank you very much for that honesty and that robust response, Francis. We are at the end of our time, but if I could just crave your indulgence for 1 second, because there is a direct question to you here, which I think is very powerful, and it brings us back to the point you've made several times, Francis, about the need for us all to be driven by gospel values, and it's this: how is synodality different from democracy? Democracy or majority rule can result in the silencing of minorities, who are often the voices of the spirit, the prophets that you referred to earlier. How do we envision authority in the gospel sense? A wonderful question.
Yeah, well, my view is authority is based in the community.
Mm-hmm.
The community, in proper mutual dialogue, makes decisions that are binding on itself. That's authority.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that simple and cogent answer. And sadly, we are, I think, I'm looking at my colleagues, if I can see them. I'm not nodding. Thank you, Penelope, at the end of our Q&A. But I will say there's quite a lot, there's a lot of very interesting information in the comments. People have posted links, people have posted links to resources, but also to interesting events. So we will make sure in one way or another that this is all transmitted to you. And we are saving, the team is going to save the comments, and we will bring back as many comments and questions as we can to our 4th session. And I just want to thank you enormously for your responses, Francis, to the point, clear, cogent, ever so helpful. Huge thanks.